Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Aaron Stein, Chief Content Officer at War on the Rocks, and what follows is Carter Burwell moderating a discussion with Erin Mahan, Adam Howard, and John Fox about government historians, the historical process inside the government bureaucracy, and how it intersects with classification and declassification issues. Enjoy the conversation.
We have three great historians from the government, which as a new member of the PIDB, I was shocked, and even planning for this conference, I was shocked to understand that the government has its own historians. We have heard from, outside historians and academics at UT and elsewhere, Columbia University, folks who have written books, but these are historians for the United States government and who regularly interact with classified information and whose job it is, as they're going to tell you, and I'm going to stop babbling, whose job it is to tell the story of some of the great work that's done at the Department of State, at the FBI, and the Department of Defense. So to my left is Adam Howard. He's the director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Historian, which publishes the FRUS series, the Foreign Relations of the United States series. From 2012 until 2019, Dr. Howard served as the general editor of the FRUS series, and prior to that, he served from 2009 to 2012 as the chief of the Middle East and Asia Division, supervising the production of FRUS volumes covering these two geographic regions. He's also an adjunct professor at George Washington University in their history department, and he has a PhD from the University of Florida. To his left is Dr. John Fox. Dr. Fox has served as FBI historian since 2003 and is also an adjunct instructor at the Catholic University's School Department of Politics, and he's been there since 2019. He has a PhD in modern history from the University of New Hampshire and an MA in political science from Boston University. And finally, on the end, Dr. Erin Mahan. She's chief historian of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and director of the Pentagon Library. She previously served as associate research fellow at the Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. From 2004 to 2008, she was chief of the Division of Arms Control, Asia and Africa in the Office of the Historian at the State Department, where she edited several volumes in the FRUS series. She has her PhD from my alma mater, University of Virginia. Thank you all for coming up here. Thank you for helping us to close out this wonderful conference. And I think I'd like to start by giving each of you the opportunity to tell us what you do at your departments to tell the story, how you engage with classified information, and how that engagement is challenging.
Let me say first, I want to echo Carter's thanks to everyone, the 5 UT-based organizations and the PIDB for putting this together, because I love having a platform from where I can shamelessly promote the Foreign Relations of the United States series, or as you heard, the FRUS series. For those of you not aware of it or never even heard of it, it's the official documentary history of U.S. foreign relations. It is arguably the largest transparency project in the world. We've published hundreds of thousands of documents from 1861 to covering right now, we're currently doing George H.W. Bush, Reagan period is what we've been publishing. And it is a series that, because we're publishing have published hundreds of thousands of documents, a significant portion of these were classified documents. So when you hear about Freedom of Information Act, which you've heard today, or the Mandatory Declassification Review, those are two engines of declassification in the government. But the third, which a lot of people don't realize, is the Foreign Relations of the United States series. So it's a very important player in declassification. And I don't know if a lot of people recognize that. And it's something where there's a really rich history here, and I think that's the other element here that I wanted to spend a little time on, is this transparency element, because this series goes all the way back to the origins of the Civil War. When the Civil War first started in 1861, Congress requested from the Lincoln administration documents of the foreign policy that the United States was going to be conducting for this war. They wanted to share it with their constituents. And the Lincoln administration had to grapple with this. What are we going to do here? We're going to have some sensitive information that would be published, routinized every end of each year of the war, however long it lasted. And they looked back on precedent. They went back and looked at previous administrations. They went as far back as the Washington administration. And they found some examples where the legislative branch had requested from the executive branch documents relating to foreign relations, and it was turned over, but they were one-offs. This was going to be routinized every year. And so ultimately the decision was made that in order for democracy to thrive, it had to be transparent, even during wartime. And so in December of 1861, the first series of documents were turned over from the Lincoln administration to Congress, and thus began the Fruit series. And I want to emphasize, too, Secretary of State William Seward was really so key to all of this, because he had to put up with some pushback that he got from his own diplomats. There was one in particular, a minister, the U.S. minister to England, Charles Francis Adams, in February 1864, writes a letter to Seward saying, look, I can't do my work when you're publishing at the end of each year all the sensitive conversations that are coming through cables, and then they're being published at the end of the year. And ultimately, Seward wrote back a month later and said, look, he truly believed that democracy derives from the people, and that the people have a right to see those documents. And so that was something that really gave the Fruit series that gravitas that it's had ever since. And as it moved through into the 20th century, it became professionalized. In the 1920s, the department hired professional historians for the first time to oversee the editorial standards of the series. So one of the things that's really an important value added in the Fruit series that you may not see in other documentary series are footnotes, editorial notes to contextualize. So when you're looking at documents, you have an understanding of things that happened before, things that happened after, where things that are referenced in the documents you just wouldn't have any kind of context for. And then the last thing I'll mention that's a really important turning point for the Fruit series is 1991. And that's when Congress passed a law that required, congressionally mandated the publication of the Fruit series. Now, this has to do with a very interesting story relating to declassification. 2 years earlier, in 1989, the Office of the Historian had published a volume covering U.S. policy in Iran during the early 1950s. Very interesting documents for those of you interested in oil, especially negotiations that the U.S. government was involved in with the British and the Iranian government, but nothing about the CIA covert operation that was involved in the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran. So this led to a big outcry. Congress gets involved, and then ultimately Congress decides, all right, we're going to make sure this law ensures that all the historians who work in the office have the access to the highest level classified documentation, that there are certain guidelines into how this material should be declassified, that the agencies have to cooperate with the Office of the Historian. Now, I'll say it here so I don't forget later. We have no declassification authority in our office. Everything has to be farmed out to the other agencies. And so it's a partnership. And because of that, it's interesting because we're housed in the State Department. The publication is considered a State Department publication, but it's really an interagency publication. It represents the entire executive branch in terms of those that are involved with U.S. foreign relations. And our guiding principle is to publish the documents that are the highest level decision-making behind U.S. foreign policy. So with that, Congress getting involved with that law really gave us a gravitas that had been lacking before. And in addition to that, I should mention, since there are members here, it also enshrined behind this congressional mandate the Historical Advisory Committee of the Department of State, which existed since 1957 to oversee the work of the Foreign Relations Series. But that law really gives the Historical Advisory Committee, composed of 9 members, 6 of whom represent major organizations, both historical, political science, and also legal scholars. And that also is a very important player in the production of the Foreign Relations Series. So from 1861 and this commitment to transparency in government through the law in 1991, which really gives it the backing that was lacking before, it has created a series that has given not only the American people, but 25% of our readership online, which all the Fruits volumes, for those of you interested, history.state.gov, all the volumes are up on that website that we published, and 25% of that readership are non-U.S. citizens. So they want to see what their governments were doing because their governments don't release as much information. And I'll just mention one more thing before I turn it over. There are other countries have their equivalent to the Office of Historian, or at least to the Fruit series. And they really look to us as the gold standard because their countries, usually the best they can do is get the documents from their foreign ministries. Whereas, as I said before, we cover the entire interagency, including the intelligence community. And that's something that they look to with great envy. And it's something I think that's really a credit to the United States government that it's committed to publishing those documents. And that's something, again, that I think makes the Fruit series so special and why I'm always happy to be in a position to spread the word to the American people in particular about what they have at their disposal. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. When we were talking backstage, Adam said, this is really good news. And we D&I Haynes last night, I think Adam Klein asked, give us some good news. And I'm not sure that she was ready to do that. But the Fruit series is really a good story about government transparency. And the other thing you mentioned there, and I know we want to talk about, is congressional authorization, because I think that's something that separates the State Department from other historians. But John, Erin, who wants to go next and tell a little bit for everybody here and on C-SPAN back at home who's watching about what you guys do?
My position is very different than either Adam's or Erin's, in that I sit in the Office of Public Affairs, which is where the FBI historian's position was created back in the 1980s when we hired our first one. Sue Falb came in and served until 93, and then the position was left open for a long time. The FBI in its history, as you may well know, has not always been a calm and even story. We are an agency who has had a lot of stuff written about us, and a lot of it has obviously been highly critical. A lot of this has to do with some of the issues that we face today with declassification and with transparency and with records. Back in the beginning days of the Bureau, back when J. Edgar Hoover took over in 1924, the idea that government records would be available to the public was not something that people tended to think about. Government records, got boxed up, put in a warehouse somewhere, and eventually were thrown out when they weren't needed. Some of them ended up at Library of Congress. But as we heard earlier today, it wasn't until the 1930s that we actually got in National Archives. And even when we did, the FBI basically said, no, our records are our records, and they are not going to National Archives. And for the most part, that is exactly what happened. A few of the pre-Hoover era records did go over eventually as microfilm, and you've been able to access them over at NARA for a good long time. But overall, FBI investigative files were to be considered closed to the public. Now, that said, a lot of what the FBI does comes out in the public, because when you are investigating a crime or when you are investigating a national security threat that touches on our national security laws, so again, another crime, it ends up in court, and the court produces a public record. And so bits and pieces of the FBI's records ended up in public. But of course, it wasn't until the late 1960s, early 1970s, when a combination of government leaks, things like the break-in of the FBI's resident agency in Media, Pennsylvania, that led to the exposure, among other things, of a program called Counterintelligence Programs, or COINTELPRO, that everybody's heard the word and very few know what it actually was. These things started to come out into the public. And of course, it was in the mix of the Watergate era, too, in which case the use of the government reins of power by the president's administration, the use and misuse of the intelligence community by President Nixon led, of course, to a sea change in Washington politics and a flourishing of exposure of what many government agencies, front and center, my bureau, were up to in those days. And the Church Committee, of course, exposed a lot of this to the public. It was at the same time as the Freedom of Information Act was also bolstered, basically, so that the FBI couldn't say that investigative records are not able to be exposed to the public. And so all of a sudden, the nature of how the FBI dealt with its records, especially with regards to the public, began to change. And at the time, we did not think of our history. When we had thought of history in the past, we actually had a PhD historian working in what was in the 1950s and 60s, the Public Affairs Office, basically. He was the guy who did the research for Don Whitehead's book, The FBI Story. But it wasn't, in a sense, the FBI putting out its own history. And even if it was one of those all roses, no thorns. It wasn't an effective history that could tell you about what was good, what was bad, what was working, what wasn't working for the Bureau. With the challenge of FOIA in the 1970s, with the initiation of the first suits against the FBI to release its records, with a lot of these things going on, with the bicentennial and the push for government historians and so forth, the Bureau did finally get around to bringing in a historian. So the historian's position in the FBI, as I said, has this long history behind it, but its role is very different from producing volumized histories of the work of the Bureau. My role can change from day to day. It can be anything from answering middle schooler questions for their History Day projects. By the way, phenomenal program, History Day. I fully support that. All the way through, Mark Felt comes out as Deep Throat, and I have to deal with the media talking about what was going on in the Bureau in the early 1970s and who this guy Felt was. I have worked with authors. I've worked with academics. I get out and talk to the public, largely in academic forums, and publish also in academic magazines. I also, of course, am in charge of the history content on the FBI.gov. When we do museum projects, I'm often brought in. So when the museum did a temporary exhibit around the 100th anniversary of the Bureau about the FBI and the media, played a major role in that. Museum work takes up a lot of time. Historians don't want to really get into that detailed. But it's a little bit of everything. As far as classified records go, although I am in public affairs, I also answer internal questions. And so I do have to deal with classified records on a regular basis, not to the extent that I'm talking to the public, though. So a lot of my work is in that sphere. And this is where again, I differ from both Adam and Erin, because my position is more of a public history position as opposed to an institutional one. So I will leave it at that.
Good news, not necessarily all bad news, but at least a story, right, of what happened before and how the challenges and...
Well, I think it is good news in that we do tend to deal with our history differently today, because we are open to talking about some of those problems of the past, whereas before we didn't. Today we are...
Maybe not so distant past either, right?
No, I don't usually talk about the most recent past. My job is more historical in that sense, but I certainly do get involved in, say, records issues, whether finding them or explaining what they mean at times. I work closely with our records management people. So in that sense, bringing in that historical perspective, I think, actually has been good. I wish more of the Department of Justice had similar. There is no historian of the Department of Justice. The marshals have one. DEA has a contract historian. I think ATF has one now, and there's a group in the Civil Rights Division that does litigation historical research, and they do a good job. But there's a lot of history out there that doesn't get done.
Thanks. Saving, of course, the absolute best for last is our historian from the Department of Defense. Please share with everyone here and watching online what you do and how you interact and what stories you tell.
Well, that plug comes from us both being University of Virginia alum, I'm sure. It's wonderful to be here. I don't want to say we're an incestuous community because that's not PC, but there are a lot of us who've worked together in the past. Mark Lawrence and I have been at history conferences, had the pleasure of working with Tim Naftali. But what I have really enjoyed about this conference is, unlike, and I speak as one who doesn't bother with social media, we're not in an echo chamber. We're actually not reiterating and going, yeah, that's my problem too. Instead, I think I've learned a great deal from my colleagues who have spoken about this. My role is both similar and dissimilar to Adam's and John's. For one thing, I'm not the DoD historian. Now, I've been on quite a few documentaries, and even though I tell them, it never translates into the name. I'm often called the Pentagon historian, the DoD historian. But in actuality, I suppose I could be called I'm the historian to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Each service program, military service program, has a historian, and those programs are much larger than mine. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, they have a history office, the Coast Guard, each of the combatant commands. And I say all this because it speaks to kind of in some respects, leads to a lack of cohesion amongst what we do, because each program's mission varies somewhat. And some of that is resource driven. It wouldn't be the government if you didn't talk about processes and resources. But my office doesn't really do documents per se, like the State Department History Office. We produce a book series. As the name kind of says it all, it's the Office of the Secretary of Defense Historical Series. And these books range from 600 to 800 pages. And yes, they focus on the Secretary of Defense, but in the larger context of the national security policy of any given presidential administration under which the secretary serves. So in that vein, we do, like the Fruce historians, we cull numerous classified materials across the interagency, from CIA to not so much FBI, defense, and other agencies. And we submit our manuscripts for declassification, and it takes about 40 years. We're about to publish our first Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense under Reagan. That first volume will come out at the end of this year, and that's over 40 years. So that might get us into kind of the challenges of doing classified history in the government. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you all. And I want to be mindful of leaving time for our crowd here to ask questions. But, one of the grave challenges, as we've heard, we're drowning with classified information, and the processes in place to declassify are not even close to catching up with it. And so many of us are thinking about how to prioritize and where to focus our limited resources to address the problem. That's got to be a question that each of you asks as you carry on your mission, as you think about what to write, as what to tell, what stories. How do you think the whether the Public Interest Declassification Board or the United States Senate or a new executive order should try and deal with prioritization?
I don't like to just whine about a problem. I'm more by nature, let's look for a solution. And I think trying to rewrite the executive order to address some of the problems that we kind of collectively face is one way. I don't think in the current executive order there's much of a seat at the table, so to speak, for historians. And I think having a closer relationship between historians and the records managers, of which we are not, is one way to start addressing the problem. I can point to one kind of success story that started in the Obama administration, was implemented fully in the Trump administration, and that involved an Argentina document collection. And that was basically, I think, Adam, you might have been involved in that as well. But we worked with our records managers to identify documents that could be declassified and turned over to the Argentine government, covering that chapter in their history of their military dictatorship. And The records managers did an excellent job using keyword searches, but there are limitations to keyword searches, and that's where the historian comes in. You know, we go through these files routinely. We know kind of where to look, how to narrow those searches, and there needs to be a constant dialogue, which I don't think every agency has, between the records people and the historians. For one, where you sit matters, and I know when I worked at State, when I worked there, we were in the Public Affairs Bureau, and the records people were elsewhere. At DOD, I now sit in an organization where our records branch is with us, so we have a kind of hand-in-glove approach. But my counterparts in the services don't have that kind of close relationship, and I think the end result is frustration at getting at the records, knowing what to prioritize to put them in for declassification. And I can go on, so I'll stop here and let Adam or John talk.
How do you guys think about prioritize
I'll
documents?
echo two things that Ezra's brought up already this morning, and that is, there's two things that I think are really be helpful if PIDB and friends of the PIDB would ever focus in on. One has been brought up over and over is funding, but one of the biggest challenges we have, because I mentioned the FRU series is housed in the State Department, but we are dealing with documents from all of the executive agencies involved with foreign policy. So their technology doesn't speak to each other. And it's something where if we can, obviously it's a funding issue, but if you can get that technology in place so that the agencies speak to each other, I think we'll see much better efficiency and more speed in terms of declassification of those documents that would be incorporated into the FRU series. And the second thing, again, Ezra also brought up, incentivization. And we get it. I mean, if you're someone sitting at a desk in the Department of Defense or the CIA or the State Department, and someone puts on your desk these highly sensitive historical documents, you're going to be probably leaning towards saying no, because you really have no incentive to say yes. And your career is on the line, and that's something where we understand it, but that's an institutional problem where it would be really helpful if there are ways to come up with that can provide incentives for people to say, you know what, it's important for me to release this information as opposed to hold it back. The third thing I'll mention is education, and that's just a constant issue of people in these agencies who review these documents are usually in their positions 2, 3, 4 years tops, typically. So when they keep rotating in and out, you have to constantly re-educate them about, hey, this is the FRU series, this is why it's important, this is the congressional mandate. And you're not always going to get an opportunity to get in front of those people the first moments they're sitting at their desk getting these documents. So that's another issue that can afford prioritization.
I find, from my perspective, I've been in the Bureau now 24 years, even though I've only been a historian for most of that. Perhaps our biggest issue, of course, because we held on to our records for so long, they didn't go to National Archives. In the early 2000s, we started to change that and actually shift millions of pages over to National Archives where they can be properly taken care of. And now the questions I get regarding classification issues, regarding FBI records, et cetera, often come down to that bottleneck of NARA just doesn't have the people to process them and to make them available. And so it's a broader government record issue even than simply declassification. Of course, FBI records, people focus on them case by case, and that makes sense because that's how the Bureau itself focuses on them. So identifying a record here and there that should be reviewed for classification isn't always the biggest problem. When we integrate that, though, with the broader intelligence community and so forth, where large tranches of our records have gone out under some of these things is because of those congressional mandates. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, the JFK Records Task Force Act. Now we're just starting to get things together under the Civil Rights Era Cold Case Act. And frankly, as far as getting information out to the public that is of interest, in some ways those targeted means are probably more effective. On the other hand, because the FBI, again, is case-based, unlike a lot of other areas in the government, actually identifying what people might want to see isn't as difficult. The big cases are the big cases, and most people aren't usually interested in the administrivia that might be elsewhere. But even there's interesting stuff, and then it comes down to simply you've got a flood of records, and picking out the gems is tough, and that's where we professionals sometimes can help.
I think it's wonderful to have kind of an outside advisory committee, but I'd also like to see the executive order rewritten to have an internal DoD voice. Because once you're in the government and you have the clearances and you're doing it day to day, you have an appreciation for both the perspective that the scholar might bring, but also the internal the yeoman voice, so to speak. So like a DoD as an ombudsman, kind of written into the executive order, I think would be a highly effective mechanism. Because when you're in the government, sadly, you have to think in terms of processes, mechanisms, because that's just the way it works. And having just an outside historian now and then highlighting problems might make the news for a 24-hour cycle, maybe even longer. But having a historian in there giving a voice on a daily basis, I think would be most effective. So that's my plug to everyone who has more gravitas than I.
Do you all write classified stories? Like, do you write histories that are classified?
Yeah, so I've talked only about the Fruit series since this is a declassification conference, but we have a significant component within our office who provide policy support for policymakers in the department, and for them we write classified histories.
Nothing in any extended sense. I certainly use classified records to answer specific questions about either a case or an event. But as far as doing an actual classified history, I've been more of a consultant at times. So
we very much do. We have the long-term projects of the books, but on a daily basis, we're answering requests from different parts of the department, mainly the Office of the Secretary of Defense. But we generate information papers. We find documents to support this or that. We do long-term classified studies. I think on average, we probably generate close to 400 or 500 classified either reference requests or information papers daily. I mean, not daily, yearly. We don't, correction there, I wish.
Are you mindful when you're doing that about how to make those records declassified, those stories?
Well, we write them for people with the clearances to inform policymakers and decision makers. So I don't think our staff at that time are mindful of the declassification. We're servicing those who are making policy on a daily basis.
Maybe can you tell people how that request comes in? It's a policymaker, a senior new official who says, "What happened over the last 3 or 4 years in this area?" Is that generally, or what happened 50 years ago in this space?
I think our office has gotten the reputation of being very responsive. DoD, sorry for the acronym speak, the Department of Defense is notorious for a lot of coordination. And so I think some of our higher-ups kind of have me and our staff on speed dial, and they know they can call us or email and say, can you get this or that? And we generate what we can on the time constraints that
what is this or that, or what's the request generally, and not specifically, but what are they asking for?
Well, I can't get into too many specifics, but things related to current great power struggles, historical analogs from, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis era to the present. And I am kind of mincing my words because I don't want to reveal on C-SPAN or ever we're being televised what the Secretary of Defense is asking us to look up. But it has meaningful impact on current foreign policy.
Decision makers need to understand what happened, in the past, and some of that is classified. And
General Mattis, and then Secretary Mattis, I mean, he was a historian in essence himself. He traveled, when he moved around, his 6,000 books went with him. So he was one Secretary of Defense who knew how to use historians and I think did so with good effect.
I can mention two things. Erin brought up one of the things we get requests for often, which are, analogies, historical analogies that can provide context for current policy. But the other thing is institutional history. A lot of policymakers want to understand how their predecessors reorganized elements within the agency. How did their predecessors handle various issues structurally? So it's not just about external policy, but also about how the department has handled internal changes in the past, or what things they've done when they faced new challenges internally, not just externally.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.